My name is Sophia, and I never imagined the first chapter of my adulthood would begin with the cold hum of hospital machines keeping me alive. I opened my eyes to a blur of fluorescent lights and the steady beeping of monitors. My chest felt like it was caving in, my throat swollen and raw. For a moment, I wasn't even sure if I had crossed into life or death. What I did know, with crushing certainty, was that I was alone. The nurses told me later what I had barely been conscious enough to register in the moment. I had been admitted in critical condition. My body had spiraled into a severe reaction that nearly killed me. Doctors warned that my organs were under dangerous strain. It was the kind of night that should have brought family rushing to my side. But my parents didn't come, not when the hospital called, not when the doctors stressed it could be my last night. They couldn't make it because my younger sister, Victoria, was out walking her dog, Dot. Imagine hearing that. Imagine being told you might not live to see morning, while the people who gave you life decided you weren't important enough to prioritize over a pet. That single fact cut deeper than any needle, any lab result, or any diagnosis could. It wasn't the first time my parents had chosen my sister over me, but lying there, half-conscious, tubes in my arms, I knew it had to be the last Dot. As machines pumped oxygen into my lungs and strangers tended to me with compassion my family had never shown, something inside me snapped awake. I could no longer ignore the truth I had buried for 26 years. My parents would never choose me. They had shown me that time and time again, from the smallest moments in childhood to this life or death situation, the fantasy that someday they would see my worth, someday they would show up, finally disintegrated under the harsh fluorescent lights of that hospital room. I was T. I remember being 7 years old, flushed with excitement as I rushed home from school. I had just won first place in the science fair. My project on plant growth had earned a big blue ribbon, and for a child who loved learning, it felt like a once-in-a-lifetime triumph. I burst into the house, ribbon clutched in my hand, eager to show them. My parents smiled politely, gave me a quick pat on the head, and then turned back to Victoria, who was wobbling along on her bike without training wheels for the first time. At 7, I convinced myself that made sense. Riding a bike was a bigger milestone than a science project. Surely they were just caught up in the moment. But moments like that repeated over and over until they became a pattern I couldn't ignore. By 12, the message was loud and clear. No matter what I achieved, Victoria's smallest accomplishments were celebrated louder. When I brought home a perfect report card, straight A's across the board, my mother nodded with mild approval before gushing over Victoria's B- in art class. When I qualified for the state swimming championships, my father said he was proud but couldn't attend because Victoria had a minor cold. Each time I swallowed the hurt and came up with excuses on their behalf. They're busy. Victoria's younger, she needs more attention. I'm older, stronger, more independent. I can handle it. I repeated those lines to myself like a mantra, a way of surviving the growing void between us. I told myself it wasn't favoritism, it was practicality. That logic shielded me, but deep down I knew the truth. I was invisible, and she was the sun they orbited. Looking back, what strikes me most is not the absence of praise, but the absence of presence. It wasn't that they failed to recognize my efforts with words. It was that they consistently chose to show up for her in ways they rarely did for ma tati ishikiyas. Victoria's soccer games were never missed. The stands were always filled with giant homemade signs and deafening cheers. Meanwhile, my milestones often happened in silence. Even when I managed to succeed despite my health struggles, they brushed it aside as though it didn't matter. For a child, that silence is deafening. It tells you, without anyone having to say the words, that you are less deserving, less important, less loved. And yet, I kept trying. That's the cruelest part of being the overlooked child. You don't stop striving and you double down. I thought if I just achieved enough, was perfect enough, maybe one day they'd look at me the way they looked at her. Maybe one day I'd be worthy of more than a pat on the head and a distracted smile. It took me years to realize that the problem wasn't me. The problem was the roles they had assigned us before we even knew who we were. Victoria was the golden child, the one whose needs, however small, would always come first. And I was the one expected to be fine on my own, no matter what. But at 12 years old, I didn't know about golden child or scapegoat dynamics. I just knew that I was the girl who could win ribbons, trophies, and medals and still go unnoticed. And that silent ache was the soil where the seeds of resentment, loneliness, and self-doubt began to grow. Seeds that would bloom in painful ways later in life. I kept telling myself things would get better as I got older. Maybe they would see me differently as I became a teenager. Maybe maturity would change how they treated me, but I was wrong. Because what came next wasn't recognition or balance. It was the start of something even harder, my health battles. And even then, my struggles would always come second to whatever was happening in Victoria's world. When I turned 16, life handed me a challenge far bigger than grades, trophies, or sibling rivalry. That was the year I was diagnosed with a severe autoimmune disorder. For most people, a condition like mine would have been a rallying point for family, a time when parents pull together, when home becomes a place of care and safety. For me, it was the opposite. My illness became just another reason for my parents to sigh, complain, and remind me that my needs were a burden. The symptoms came on suddenly. Fatigue so heavy I felt like I was dragging my body through mud, rashes that burned across my skin, and most dangerously, severe allergic reactions triggered by stress, certain foods, and especially animal dander. A single exposure could spiral into something life-threatening if I wasn't careful. I needed daily medication, regular monitoring, and strict lifestyle adjustments. My doctors were clear. This wasn't just inconvenient. It was serious. But to my parents, it wasn't life-altering. It was inconvenient. I remember the first time I had to be rushed to the emergency room after an exposure. I could barely breathe, my skin covered in hives, every muscle shaking with fear. On the drive there, my father's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white, not from worry for me, but from frustration. "Do you have any idea how expensive this is going to be?" he muttered, as if my body's betrayal was an intentional act of rebellion. My mother wasn't much better. She treated my flare-ups like disruptions to her calendar. Whenever I had to miss school for appointments, she would sigh loudly, rearrange her schedule with visible irritation, and remind me how much trouble it was. "You're strong," she'd say in a clipped tone, as though that excused her lack of comfort or compassion. Meanwhile, Victoria thrived. She was healthy, athletic, radiant, the kind of teen-ager who seemed to glow under the spotlight. She became a star on her high school soccer team, and my parents never missed a game. The contrast couldn't have been starker. While I sat at home juggling medications and hospital visits, they sat in the bleachers with giant handmade signs cheering, "Go, Victoria!" I often joined them even when I was weak, dizzy, or fighting off nausea. I sat on the sidelines clapping for her, while quietly wishing someone, anyone, would notice that I was barely holding myself upright. But in their eyes, the picture of health and vitality that was my sister always demanded more attention than the quiet suffering of their older daughter. That's the cruel irony of illness. When you're visibly broken, a cast, crutches, stitches, people know how to respond. But when your sickness is invisible, when your body betrays you in ways that aren't always obvious, people dismiss it. To my parents, I wasn't really sick. I was dramatic. I was sensitive. I was too focused on my health. They minimized every flare-up until I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was too weak. It took years before I realized how damaging that dismissal was. I didn't just grow up fighting my body, I grew up fighting the belief that I deserved care at all. But if my illness didn't soften their hearts, it hardened something inside me. I became fiercely independent, determined to manage everything on my own. If they weren't going to show up, I would learn to show up for myself. I organized my medications, researched my condition, and forced myself to push through pain and fatigue. I built an armor of self-reliance because I had no choice. Still, a part of me hoped that someday, if things got really bad, my parents would prove me wrong, that in a true crisis, they would show me the love and protection I had been denied. That hope carried me for years, But as I would later learn, hope can be the heaviest burden of all. By the time I graduated high school, I had already learned to lower my expectations. I didn't expect cheers from the stands or long hugs when I came home with achievements. But when it came to college, I thought maybe, just maybe, my parents would see the bigger picture. College wasn't just another milestone. It was the beginning of an entire future. Surely, they would want to invest in that. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table when my parents told me they could only afford to financially support one of us through higher education. My heart raced, but I stayed quiet, waiting for them to say my name. After all, I had worked hard, maintained a perfect GPA, and already earned scholarship offers. If anyone could make the most of their support, it was me. But the words didn't go the way I thought they would. "Victoria will need more help," my father said simply, as though it were the most obvious decision in the world. "She's not as academically inclined as you are. You'll be fine on your own." The finality in his tone cut deeper than any insult. Just like that, the choice was made. I was the independent one, the capable one, which in their eyes meant I didn't deserve help. My dreams of sharing this journey with some semblance of family support evaporated in that moment. So I did what I always did. I picked myself up and carried the load alone. I took on 3 jobs, tutoring, waitressing, and retail, while carrying a full course load. I balanced early mornings, late nights, and weekends sacrificed just to cover tuition and living expenses. And despite the constant exhaustion, I excelled. I maintained a 4.0 GPA and graduated with honors. Victoria's path was a sharp contrast. My parents paid her tuition, bought her supplies, and even gave her a car to make her commute easier. But within 1 semester, she dropped out, saying it was too stressful. Instead, being disappointed, my parents comforted her. They told her college wasn't for everyone, that she had tried her best. Then, in a move that still stings when I think about it, they bought her a brand new car to make her feel better. The message couldn't have been clearer. My sacrifices didn't matter. My independence was treated like a reason to ignore me, while her dependence was treated like something to reward. I should have been furious, but at the time, I just told myself the same story I always had. They didn't mean harm. They just thought I could handle more. Deep down, though, the truth was undeniable. No matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, I would always come second to Victoria, even when she gave up. Looking back, the college years solidified a pattern that had already been written into my childhood. I would carry my own weight while they carried hers. And for a long time, I believed that was love. By the time I reached my mid-20s, I had learned to accept the unfairness in my family. I had built a life of my own, a good job at a marketing firm, a small apartment 30 miles away, and a circle of acquaintances who, unknowingly, gave me more support than my own parents ever had. I still visited home occasionally, still tried to bridge the gap, still clung to the hope that things would change. But then came Snowball. Snowball was no ordinary dog. He was a purebred Samoyed, a fluffy, snow-white cloud that cost over $3,000. My parents didn't just allow Victoria to get him, they funded the entire purchase, along with all the accessories, specialized food, custom furniture, even a climate-controlled room they converted just for him. It was over the top in a way they had never been for me. The problem wasn't just that they spoiled Victoria with yet another extravagant gift. The real problem was that they knew. They knew I had a life-threatening allergy to animal dander. They knew the danger that kind of dog posed to me. My entire childhood had been punctuated by ER visits and medication schedules. My condition wasn't a mystery, and yet, when I raised my concern, their response was as cold as it was predictable. "You can take your medication, sweetie," my mother said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Victoria really needs this dog for her emotional well-being." There it was. The truth I had always known but never heard so plainly. Her emotional comfort mattered more than my physical survival. I can't put into words the sting of hearing your own mother brush off your health, not just your comfort but your life, in favor of a pet. It was the final confirmation that, in our family, My needs would always come last. If my existence was inconvenient to Victoria's happiness, then I was the one expected to adjust. Still, I tried. I told myself maybe I could take stronger medication before visits. Maybe I could limit my time in their house. Maybe somehow I could make it work, because at the end of the day, they were my family, and some desperate part of me kept hoping things would be different. But reality proved me wrong again. Every time I visited, Snowball was treated as royalty. Conversations revolved around his training, his diet, his personality quirks. Meanwhile, I sat at the dinner table sneezing, wheezing, breaking out in hives, while my parents nodded absent-mindedly at anything I tried to share. My recent promotion? Ignored. The night classes I was taking to further my career? Dismissed. But the dog's favorite chew toy? That could fuel an hour-long discussion. The irony was suffocating. A dog, who had been in the family for less than a Y, here, was celebrated as a cherished member of the household, and I, their daughter of 26 years, was treated like an afterthought, expected to quietly risk my health just to sit at the same table. It's strange how sometimes the smallest things become the tipping point. You'd think it would be the years of neglect, the missed milestones, the constant dismissals that finally broke me. But no, it was Snowball. It was realizing that not even my medical condition, something that could end my life, was enough to make them prioritize me over Victoria's wants. That was when the quiet resignation I had lived with for years started turning into something sharper. Resentment, anger, clarity. Snowball wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol, a living, breathing reminder of my family's choices. Every bark echoed the truth: I would never come first. And as painful as that was, it also forced me to start asking a question I had avoided my whole life. If my own parents didn't value me, why was I still fighting so hard to earn their love? I didn't know it yet, but Snowball would become the catalyst, the dog that changed everything. The one decision that would set the stage for the breaking point that nearly cost me my life. 3 months after my parents brought Snowball home, I decided to give them another chance. Maybe it was the optimist in me. Maybe it was the lifelong habit of hoping they'd finally see me. Either way, I picked up the phone and suggested dinner. To my surprise, my mother sounded genuinely delighted. "That sounds wonderful, Sophia. I'll make your favorite lasagna, and your father will grab that cheesecake you love from the bakery downtown." Her enthusiasm gave me hope. For the rest of the week, I built up the evening in my mind. Maybe they had noticed my absence. Maybe they missed me. I even splurged on a nice bottle of wine and a new outfit, telling myself it was worth the effort. But when I arrived at their house, reality hit me the moment I heard barking. "Is Victoria's dog here?" I asked, already feeling the familiar tightness in my chest. "Of course Snowball's here," my mother replied, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "This is his home. Victoria's staying the weekend." Her words landed like a slap. I had been so careful, so hopeful, and they hadn't even considered my health. Once again, I was expected to put myself at risk for their convenience. Ignacy Victoria was sprawled on the couch, Snowball in her lap, his white fur flying everywhere. "Hey, sis," she said casually, barely looking up from her phone. "Look how big Snowball's gotten. Isn't he gorgeous?" I forced a polite smile, keeping my distance. "He's fluffy." What I didn't say was that my throat was already tightening. Hives were forming on my skin, and each breath felt heavier than the last. I excused myself to the bathroom, popped another dose of medication, and used my inhaler. Staring at my reflection, I gave myself the same pep talk I had repeated my whole life. Just get through dinner. Keep the peace. Don't make it a big deal. When I returned to the dining room, the lasagna was waiting, and for a brief moment I let myself imagine this could still be the family dinner I had dreamed of. But as soon as we sat down, the conversation turned, not to me, not to catching up on my life, but to Snowball, his training progress, his favorite treats, the cute tricks he was learning. It was endless. I tried to interject. I mentioned my recent promotion. I brought up the night classes I had started. Both times, my parents nodded politely, then quickly steered the conversation back to the dog. By the time dessert came, my body was screaming. My sinuses were clogged, my skin was covered in angry hives, and breathing felt like pulling air through a straw. Finally, Victoria glanced at me. "Whoa, Sophia, you look terrible. Are you having a reaction?" Or something. "Yes," I wheezed. "I told Mom I'm allergic when I got here." My mother frowned. "I thought you were exaggerating. You've always been a bit dramatic about your health issues." That sentence nearly broke me. Years of being dismissed, minimized, and brushed aside were condensed into one cruel line. "I'm not being dramatic," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have a documented medical condition. My doctor has specifically warned me." But my father cut in, his tone sharp. "Well, you seemed fine enough to eat a full dinner and dessert." I wanted to scream. Did they not see me struggling to breathe? Did they not see the hives crawling up my neck? Or did they just not care? "I think I should go," I finally said, pushing back from the table. "Thank you for dinner, but I'm not feeling well." "But we haven't even had coffee yet," my mother protested, "and I wanted to show you the new curtains in the living room." Another dismissal, another moment where my needs didn't matter. Victoria rolled her eyes as I gathered my things. "You're always so serious about everything. It's just a little allergic reaction. Pop a Benadryl and chill out." Her words followed me out the door, each syllable digging into my chest as I struggled to breathe. I drove home in silence, my throat tight, my skin on fire, tears of frustration stinging my eyes. By the time I collapsed in my apartment, nebulizer mask strapped to my face, one truth echoed louder than the wheeze in my lungs. It would never be enough. I could bring wine, wear new clothes, endure allergic reactions, and smile through the pain, but I would never matter as much as that dog. And deep down, I knew this wasn't just another disappointing dinner. This was the beginning of something much worse. 3 days after that disastrous dinner, I woke up with the crushing weight of a storm inside my body. My chest felt like an elephant was sitting on it. My skin burned with angry hives, and when I tried to stand, the world tilted so violently I nearly collapsed back onto the bed. This wasn't just another flare-up. I knew my body, and this was different. Worse. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and called my doctor's office, leaving a voicemail describing my symptoms. This wasn't my first severe reaction, but usually they peaked within a day or two. The fact that I was getting worse on day 3 was terrifying. Still, I clung to the old habit of minimizing my needs. I forced myself to shower, dress, and head to work because I had a big presentation that day. Missing it felt unthinkable. By the time I staggered into the office, my vision was tunneling. My colleague Natalie took one look at me and rushed over. "Sophia, you look terrible. What's going on?" "Allergic reaction," I croaked. "Got exposed to a dog. Thought I could push through." Her face hardened. "You need to see a doctor, right now." "I have a presentation," I tried to argue. My voice was weak, my breaths shallow. "I'll cover it," she insisted. "Your health is more important. Do you need me to drive you to urgent care?" I shook my head, embarrassed by the attention. "I'll call my doctor again." This time, when I spoke to a nurse, her tone was urgent. "You need to get to the ER immediately. This sounds like it could turn into anaphylaxis. With your history, we can't take chances." I hung up, torn between fear and the stubborn instinct to prove I could handle things, but Natalie had already grabbed her purse. "I'm taking you," she said firmly. And thank God she did. By the time we reached the hospital, my throat felt like it was closing. At triage, the nurse took one look at me and shouted for help. Suddenly, I was surrounded. IVs in my arms, injections of epinephrine and steroids, oxygen strapped to my face. Doctors fired questions while my mind slipped in and out of consciousness. The last thing I remember clearly was whispering for my neighbor, Mrs. Garza, to feed my cat was. I didn't know then was how close I had come to never waking up again. The hospital tried repeatedly to reach my parents. Hours later, when they finally answered, the doctor told them plainly, "Your daughter's condition is critical. tonight might be her last night. And their response? "We can't come. Our other daughter is walking her dog. We need to pick her up afterward." Even when the doctor repeated the words, "critical condition, organs under stress, she may not survive the night," they refused. My parents chose Victoria's dog walk over their daughter's life. That night, as my body battled itself, it was strangers who held my hand. Nurses who whispered encouragement, doctors who fought to stabilize me, Natalie who stayed until late in the evening, refusing to leave until she knew I was safe. Not once did my parents call. Not once did my sister text to see if I was alive, and something inside me shattered. I had spent 26 years believing that no matter how invisible I felt, no matter how overlooked I was, surely in a life-or-death situation they would show up. Surely then they would put me first. But lying in that ICU bed, with machines keeping me alive and no family by my side, the truth was unavoidable. I could nearly die, and they still wouldn't come. When morning came and my condition finally stabilized, I felt hollow. My body had survived, but something deeper inside me had not. The last thread tying me to the illusion of family had been cut. In its place, however, was something unexpected: clarity. If they wouldn't be there for me in my darkest hour, then I didn't need to keep chasing their love in the light. For the first time, I stopped asking what was wrong with me and started asking what was wrong with them. That shift, painful, liberating, irreversible, was the beginning of my true survival, not just of my body, but of my spirit. And it led to, the letter, the one that would change everything. When I finally regained full consciousness in the hospital, I turned my head, half expecting, against all reason, to see my parents waiting. But the chair beside my bed was empty. The nurse checking my vitals smiled kindly and confirmed what I already knew. They had never come. It was strange. The realization didn't feel like a fresh wound. It felt like a scar that had always been there, only now I could finally see it. My parents had chosen not to come, even when doctors warned I might not make it through the night. There was no spinning it this time. No excuse about being busy or misunderstanding or thinking I could handle it. They had chosen, and the choice wasn't me. That clarity brought with it a strange calm. I had spent so long bargaining with myself, holding on to scraps of hope, convincing myself that if I just achieved enough, loved hard enough, or endured quietly enough, things would change. But lying there in that sterile room, surrounded by machines and strangers who had shown me more compassion in one night than my parents had in 26 years, I knew it was over. I couldn't keep waiting for them to see me. I had to see myself. So I asked the nurse, Ellie, for paper and a pen. She brought them without hesitation, setting a small lap desk across my bed. And slowly, with shaky hands and a heart that ached more than my lungs, I began to write. The words poured out of me like a flood I had been holding back for years. I wrote about being 7 years old with a blue ribbon in my hand and no one to clap for me. I wrote about the nights spent alone in the ER while they cheered for Victoria at soccer games. I wrote about college, about working 3 jobs while they bought her a new car for dropping out. I wrote about Snowball, the dog whose comfort mattered more than my survival. And then I wrote about the hospital, about the night I almost died alone. Out how that moment had stripped away the last of my illusions. But the letter wasn't just an indictment. It was also a boundary. For the first time in my life, I set one clearly. I could no longer participate in a family dynamic that required me to disappear in order for my sister to shine. I told them I needed space, not as punishment, but as survival. I asked them not to contact me until they were willing to acknowledge the harm they had done and commit to change. 4-page, every line etched with truth I had swallowed for decades. Every word a release of the weight I had carried since childhood. When I finished, I sealed the letter in an envelope and wrote their names on the front. Ellie slipped it into her pocket with a look of quiet understanding. "I'll make sure they find this," she said softly. On the day of my discharge, I left the hospital not with my parents by my side, but with Natalie, who picked me up and carried my bag. Before I left, I handed the envelope to Ellie and asked her to place it on the bed so it would look like I had left it behind. That afternoon, I watched from a coffee shop across the street as my parents finally walked into the hospital, a full week late. They disappeared through the glass doors, oblivious to the fact that their daughter, alive but forever changed, was sitting just yards away. I didn't know what would happen when they read my letter. I didn't know if it would break them, anger them, or be dismissed like so many of my pleas before. But I knew this much. Whatever came next, I was no longer the girl begging to be seen. I was the woman who had finally spoken her truth. Leaving that letter behind was both terrifying and liberating. For days afterward, I found myself bracing for the fallout, expecting frantic calls, angry messages, maybe even a confrontation at my apartment door. But what I got instead was silence. At first, the quiet stung. A small part of me still hoped my parents would read my words and rush to prove me wrong, to tell me I mattered. Instead, there was nothing. Not a single call, not a single message. That silence told me everything. Even when confronted with the truth in black and white, their instinct was avoidance. 4 days later, my phone finally buzzed with a voicemail. It was my mother's voice, clipped and cold. "Sophia, we got your letter. I think you're being very dramatic about this whole situation. Your father and I have always done our best for you and Victoria. Call us when you're feeling more rational." Her words made my stomach twist, not because they surprised me, but because they didn't. Even after I nearly died, even after the hospital called them and begged them to come, she still managed to minimize everything to a matter of me being dramatic. That voicemail was the confirmation I needed. I hadn't been overreacting. I hadn't been imagining things. This was who they were, and who they had always been. A couple of days later, my father sent an email. His tone was more measured, even regretful in parts. "Your letter forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths," he wrote. "I can't deny we haven't always been attentive to your needs. That night at the hospital, we didn't realize how serious it was. We've become so used to you handling everything yourself. That was our mistake, and I'm sorry for it." But then came the caveat. "Still, I think you're being unfair in your characterization of our relationship. We've always been proud of you, even if we didn't show it in the ways you wanted." It was a half apology at best, acknowledgement without accountability. He admitted to the specific incident but resisted seeing the larger pattern, the same pattern that had defined my entire life. For once, though, I didn't feel the familiar pull of guilt. I didn't rush to reassure him or soften my stance. Instead, I sat with the discomfort and realized I had a choice. I could continue engaging on their terms, minimizing my pain to keep the peace, or I could hold the boundary I had set in that letter. So I replied briefly, "Dad, thank you for acknowledging you should have come to the hospital. That means something to me. But this isn't about one incident. It's about a lifelong pattern that nearly cost me my life. I need time and space to heal. I hope you can respect that." It was short, direct, and for the first time in my life, unapologetic. And then I let the silence return. Something incredible happened in that silence. I began to feel lighter. Without the constant cycle of trying, failing, and hurting, I had space to breathe. For the first time, I wasn't living in reaction to their neglect. I was living for myself. It wasn't easy. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. I still heard their voices in my head, telling me I was dramatic, ungrateful, too independent for my own good. But now I had something stronger to counter it. The truth, written in my own hand, sealed in that letter. That letter had been a goodbye to the girl who begged for love, and a hello to the woman who demanded respect. I expected silence from my parents after the letter. What I didn't expect was the call that came from Victoria. It was a few weeks into my recovery when her name flashed on my phone. I hesitated before answering, unsure what kind of conversation this would be. When I picked up, her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "Mom and Dad are acting weird," she said, without preamble. "They won't tell me what was in your letter, but they've been fighting a lot. And Mom, she cries randomly. What did you say to them?" I took a breath. "I told them the truth," I replied simply. about how they've treated me compared to you, about how they didn't come to the hospital when doctors said I might die because they were helping you walk your dog. There was a long silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was subdued. I didn't know it was that serious. They just said you were having a reaction and you'd be fine. Her words stung. Of course they had downplayed it. Of course they had protected her from the reality. But then came the question that caught me off guard. Would you have done anything differently if you'd known? I paused, genuinely curious. Would you? Another silence. Then a hesitant admission. I don't know. I've never really had to think about it. Things have always revolved around what I want. Her honesty startled me. For the first time, I heard a crack in the golden child armor, a glimpse of someone who might, beneath the entitlement, be capable of reflection. That's not your fault, I told her gently. That's how Mom and Dad raised us. But I can't be part of that anymore. It nearly killed me. Literally. Her voice broke slightly. Are you saying you don't want to be my sister anymore? No, I said softly. I'm saying I need to rebuild my relationship with myself first. I've spent my whole life trying to earn love from our parents. It's left me hollow inside. I need to learn who I am without that weight. We ended the call without a resolution. But something had shifted. For the first time, Victoria was forced to look at our family dynamic through a lens that wasn't tinted by praise and indulgence. In the weeks that followed, she reached out more often. At first, just casual texts, then deeper questions. Was it really that bad for you growing up? Do you remember times when they missed things for me? Slowly, she began piecing together the reality I had lived with all along. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a beginning. A small, fragile crack of light breaking through years of shadow. And for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not for my parents, but for my sister. As the weeks passed, my world began to look different. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing after my parents' attention or bending myself into impossible shapes to win their approval. Instead, I started noticing the people who had been there all along. The ones who showed up without conditions, without judgment, without asking me to shrink so someone else could shine. It was Natalie, my colleague, who had rushed me to the hospital and sat by my bed when my own parents didn't bother. She continued to check in daily, bringing small comforts, fresh clothes, snacks I could actually eat, even silly magazines to distract me. What had started as a workplace friendship grew into something deeper. Proof that genuine care doesn't have to be written into your DNA to be real. It was Mrs. Garza, my elderly neighbor who fed my cat when I couldn't, who showed up with homemade soup, who reminded me with a simple smile that compassion often lives next door. She told me stories about her 5 children and 12 grandchildren scattered across the country. We look out for each other, you and I, she said. That's what neighbors are for. It was my colleagues, people I'd never considered close friends, who organized visits, brought flowers, and covered my work responsibilities without complaint. People I hadn't expected to step up became the ones who stood strongest when I needed them most. Even my doctors and nurses, like Ellie, who held my hand through the worst night of my life, and Dr. Rivera, who spent extra time explaining my condition with patience and kindness, they became part of a support system I hadn't realized I had. And slowly, I began to see what had been invisible to me before. Family isn't just the people you're born to. Family is the people who show up, the ones who care enough to notice when you're struggling, the ones who don't dismiss your pain but sit with you in it. I updated my emergency contacts, removing my parents and adding Natalie and Mrs. Garza. I changed my medical directives so that if I were ever incapacitated, my parents would not be consulted. For the first time, I chose who my family would be, not out of obligation, but out of love and trust. Meanwhile, Victoria began to shift in her own way. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out more. 2 months after my hospital stay, she made a surprising decision. She rehomed Snowball with a family friend who had children and a big yard. I realized I never really wanted a dog, she admitted. I just wanted Mom and Dad's attention, but it wasn't fair. Not to him and not to you." Her words floored me. For years I had seen her as selfish, thoughtless, and blind to the damage she benefited from. But for the first time, she was beginning to see the truth for herself. We started meeting for coffee once a month, cautiously rebuilding a sisterhood outside of our parents' influence. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honesty was more than we'd ever had before. For decades, I believed that family meant sacrifice, that love had to be earned through silence, achievement, and endless forgiveness. But I learned that true family is built differently. It is steady, consistent, and mutual. It isn't about who shares your last name, but who shares your burdens, who celebrates your victories, who notices your pain and doesn't turn away. Redefining family didn't mean I lost everything. It meant I finally gained what I had been searching for all along: connection, care, and the freedom to belong without proving my worth. 6 months have passed since the day my parents finally walked into that hospital, too late to matter, and found only a letter waiting on the bed where their daughter had nearly died. In those 6 months, my life has transformed more than in the 26 years that came before it. The physical reminders of that night have faded. The hives are gone, my breathing steady again, my autoimmune condition stable under a new treatment plan. But the deeper changes aren't written on my skin. They live in my heart, in my choices, in the way I see myself now. For the first time, I live free from the desperate chase for my parents' approval. I've stopped begging for scraps of attention. I've stopped telling myself excuses that kept me trapped in an endless loop of hope and disappointment. Instead, I've started building something new, a life where my worth isn't measured by how much I sacrifice for people who can't or won't value me. That's the real lesson I carry. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. I can forgive my parents for being unable to give what they probably never received themselves. I can even understand that their favoritism came from their own brokenness, not mine. But forgiveness does not mean accepting the same cycles of pain. Forgiveness, for me, means letting go of the fantasy of who they could have been, and finally, embracing the truth of who they are. And in that truth, I found freedom. I've learned that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love, respect, and the willingness to show up when it matters most. A nurse who stayed past her shift to hold my hand when I was fading. A coworker who drove me to the ER and visited every day after. A neighbor who fed my cat and brought me soup. These people showed me more loyalty, compassion, and care than the parents who raised me ever did. That realization once felt painful. Now it feels empowering because it means I get to choose. I get to decide who belongs in my circle, who earns the title of family in my life. Even my sister, once the golden child at the center of everything, has started her own journey of awakening. Our relationship is fragile but real, no longer defined by competition or favoritism, but by honesty. And honesty, no matter how uncomfortable, is the foundation for something stronger than the illusion we grew up with. But perhaps the greatest shift has been within myself. For 26 years, I believed I had to earn love, through achievements, through silence, through perfection. Now I know better. My worth is not conditional. It never was. I am valuable simply because I exist. That truth is the anchor I return to on hard days, the reminder that steadies me when old habits creep back in. So if you hear yourself in my story, if you are the overlooked child, the scapegoat, the one who has spent a lifetime trying to earn love that should have been freely given, I want you to know this: you deserve better. Your value does not depend on someone else's ability to see it. You do not have to keep breaking yourself into pieces for people who refuse to notice you whole. Sometimes the bravest and most loving thing you can do is walk away, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. Not to punish them, but to save yourself. That's what my letter was. Not a goodbye to my parents, but a hello to myself. And if my story resonates with you, I hope it's a reminder that you don't have to wait until you're on a hospital bed to finally draw your boundaries. You can start today. You can choose yourself right now. Because family isn't just who you're born to, it's who shows up, who loves you as you are, and who helps you remember, even on your hardest days, that you were worthy all along.